8 years ago, a telegram told him his bride was dead. He locked his heart away and never came down from the mountain. Then his sister brought a stranger to his cabin, and when she lifted her face, he recognized the eyes he had been mourning for 8 years. She was alive. She had always been alive. And the man who sent that telegram was coming to take her back. If you want to know how a mail-order bride and a broken rancher discovered that fate had stolen 8 years from them, and how she fought to keep it from stealing anything more, stay with me until the end. The window would not open quietly. Clara Whitfield pressed both palms against the frozen frame and pushed until the wood groaned and the ice along the sill cracked like a whisper that wanted to be a scream. Below her, the saloon throbbed with piano music and the low roar of men who had been drinking since sundown. Above her, the Wyoming sky hung black and starless, heavy with the kind of cold that does not ask permission before it kills. She had torn the bed sheet into strips and knotted them together with hands that would not stop shaking. The knots were tight. She had learned to tie knots on her father's farm in Pennsylvania before he became the kind of man who locked doors instead of opening them. That was a long time ago. But hands remember what the heart tries to forget. The makeshift rope hung from the bedpost to the windowsill. Below the window, a wooden awning jutted out over the saloon's side entrance. Below the awning, the ground. Below the ground, whatever came next. Clara swung her legs over the sill. The cold hit her like a wall. Her thin wool coat, the only coat she owned, offered nothing against the Wyoming winter. She gripped the sheet rope and lowered herself, feet searching for the awning's edge. Her arms burned, her fingers screamed. The knots held. Her boots found the awning. She let go of the rope and crouched on the wooden ledge, breathing hard, breath rising in white clouds that vanished into the dark. The piano below her played something fast and careless. No one had heard. She dropped from the awning to the frozen ground. The impact buckled her knees and sent a sharp pain up through her right ankle. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasted blood, stood, and ran. She ran down the alley between the saloon and the feed store, her boots crunching on ice and gravel, her breath ragged, her shadow thrown long by the light leaking from the saloon windows. She ran past the church with its crooked steeple and past the general store with faded letters that she could not read in the dark. She ran until the buildings ended and the open road began and the cold wrapped around her like something alive and hostile. Then she stopped, because there was nowhere left to run to. The train station sat at the edge of town, a wooden platform with a bench and a lamp that had burned out hours ago. Clara sank onto the bench and pulled her coat tight and pressed her bag against her chest. The bag contained everything she owned in the world. One change of clothes, a Bible with a cracked spine, a letter she had written to a man named Drummond and the letters he had written back, and a handkerchief embroidered with the initials CW that had belonged to her mother and still smelled faintly of lavender if she pressed it to her face and believed hard enough. She was 27 years old. She had no money, no family, no home, and the train would not come until spring melted the snow from the mountain tracks. She sat on that bench and watched her breath freeze in the air and tried to understand how she had ended up here. Again, trapped by a man who used paper and promises the way other men use fists and chains. 72 hours ago, she had been on a train headed west with something she had not felt in years. Hope, small and fragile and probably foolish, but hope nonetheless. She had found the advertisement in a newspaper left on a church pew in the boarding house where she had been living since the school closed. A small square of ink between ads for patent medicine and land sales. Good man in Wyoming territory seeks wife, has ranch and land, willing to provide honest work and honest life, respects a woman who works hard. Clara had read it 3 times. Then she had gone back to her room and written a letter by candlelight with her coat still on because the boarding house never heated the upper floors. She wrote about her teaching, her years on a farm, her willingness to work. She did not write about her father or the locked room or the 8 years she had spent learning that freedom was not something given, but something taken. The man who wrote back called himself S. Drummond. His letters were warm, detailed. He described the ranch, the mountains, the clean air, the space where a woman could breathe. He said he admired independence. He said he had been alone too long and wanted a partner, not a servant. He sent 11 letters in all, and each one loosened something inside Clara that had been wound tight for so long she had forgotten it could move. She signed the marriage contract, sold her books, bought a train ticket, and rode west with nothing but a bag, a contract, and a promise written in ink by a man she had never seen. No one met her at the station in Cedar Hollow. She waited 2 hours on the platform with her bag at her feet and the wind pulling at her coat. The town was small and hard-looking, a single main street of packed dirt lined with buildings that leaned into each other for support. The only building that looked prosperous was the saloon at the center of the street, freshly painted, well lit, the kind of place where money lived. A heavy man appeared just before dark. He wore a vest buttoned tight over a broad belly, and his face was flushed red from something that was not the cold. His smile was wide and showed too many teeth. His eyes showed nothing at all. Silas Drummond. He introduced himself with the easy charm of a man who had practiced being pleasant until it became a kind of weapon. He took her bag without asking and led her not toward a ranch or a homestead, but toward the saloon. Clara stopped walking. "Where is the ranch?" Drummond turned. The smile did not falter. "I own this establishment," he said, gesturing at the saloon with a pride that expected to be shared. "Fine building. Roof over your head. Work for your hands. You wrote about land, cattle, an honest life. Honest is what you make of it, Miss Whitfield." He reached into his coat and produced the contract she had signed. Her own handwriting stared back at her from the bottom of the page. "You agreed to come here. You agreed to this arrangement. The law is on my side." Clara looked at him, at his soft hands that had never held a plow or mended wire, at his polished buttons, at the smile that did not reach his eyes. And she understood with a clarity that felt like falling that every word he had written was a lie designed to bring her here. There was no ranch. There was no honest life. There was a saloon and a man who collected women the way other men collected debts. He took her upstairs to a room above the saloon floor. Small, clean enough. A bed, a dresser, a window that looked out onto the alley. He told her to rest, told her she would begin work in the morning, told her the door would stay unlocked because he trusted her to honor her word. The door did not stay unlocked. She heard the bolt slide from outside 15 minutes after he left. Clara sat on the bed. She did not cry. She had spent too many years locked in rooms to waste tears on another one. Instead, she did what she always did when the world tried to close around her. She looked for the exit, the window. She tested it. Painted shut, but the paint was old and the frame was dry. She could force it. Below the awning, below that, the ground, below that, the dark. She could work with dark. She had been working with dark her whole life. But first she searched the room, not for comfort, for information. In the bottom drawer of the dresser beneath a moth-eaten wool blanket, she found two things: a cheap tin wedding ring, tarnished green, and a small piece of cloth torn from a larger garment with a name embroidered in blue thread: Sarah Bowen. Clara held the cloth in her palm. She did not know who Sarah Bowen was. She did not know what had happened to her. But the ring and the cloth and the locked door told a story that needed no words. Someone had been in this room before her. Someone who had left these things behind, or had not been allowed to take them. She folded the cloth carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Then she began tearing the bedsheet into strips. That was 72 hours ago. Now Clara sat on the station bench in the frozen dark and waited for a morning that would bring nothing but more cold and more questions and the absolute certainty that Silas Drummond would come looking for her. He came at dawn. The sky had barely grayed when Drummond appeared on the street with Deputy Roy Pike walking one step behind him. Pike was young 30 at most, with a nervous hand that rested near the butt of his holstered pistol. Not gripping it, just resting. A reminder of what could happen if reminders became necessary. Drummond was not angry. That was the worst part. His face carried the same pleasant expression he wore like a mask, the face of a man who had already calculated every outcome and found them all favorable to himself. He stopped 6 feet from the bench. Deputy Pike stopped behind him. Two women from the church across the street paused on the boardwalk to watch. "Miss Whitfield," Drummond's voice was conversational, loud enough for the women to hear. "You signed a contract and then fled in the night. That is a breach of a legal agreement. I could have you detained right now." Clara stood. Her legs were stiff from the cold. Her ankle throbbed. But she stood straight and she did not look away. "I signed a contract to marry a rancher," she said. "You promised land. Cattle, an honest life. You own a saloon. There is no ranch. There is no cattle. Every promise in your letters was a lie. Drummond's smile tightened but held. He turned to the growing audience. Two more townspeople had stopped. A man loading feed onto a wagon, a woman with a market basket. I brought this young woman all the way from Pennsylvania. Drummond said, his voice carrying the practiced sorrow of a man who has rehearsed his grievance. Gave her passage, gave her a room, gave her a future. And she runs off into the middle of the night like a thief. He shook his head slowly. Who knows where she really comes from? Who knows what kind of woman does something like that? The words landed on Clara like stones. She could feel the judgment forming around her. The women on the boardwalk exchanged glances. The man with the feed wagon looked away. This was how it worked. This was how men like Drummond turned the world against women like her. Not with fists, but with words. With stories told loudly enough and often enough that they became the truth. But Clara did not drop her eyes. She stood on that platform with her cheap coat and her one hand, her bruised ankle, and she held herself the way her mother had taught her to hold herself before her mother died and her father became someone else entirely. I am a school teacher, Mr. Drummond. I signed a contract with a man who claimed to be a rancher. You are not a rancher, and I am not property. Drummond studied her. For one moment, the pleasant mask slipped and something cold looked out from behind his eyes. Patient, calculating. The look of a man deciding whether to apply more pressure now or save it for later. He chose later. 30 days, Miss Whitfield. That is what the contract gives you. 30 days to fulfill your obligation, or I come back with a judge and a court order. He tipped his hat, an absurd gesture of courtesy that mocked the cruelty beneath it. I will be seeing you. He walked away. Deputy Pike followed. The women on the boardwalk turned and whispered to each other with the particular energy of people who have just witnessed something they intend to discuss for weeks. One of the women had not moved. She stood at the corner of the boardwalk with a blue wool dress buttoned to the throat and a cameo brooch at her collar, and she watched Clara with the eyes of a woman who has already decided what she is looking at and does not intend to be confused by evidence. Prudence Gatewood was 52 years old and thin as a fence rail, and carried herself with the absolute certainty of a person who believed her opinion and the Lord's were interchangeable. She looked at Clara's worn boots, her calloused hands, her sunburned face, her frayed collar. She looked at the bow that contained everything Clara owned, and she smiled the way a cat smiles at a bird it has cornered. A mail-order bride who runs from her arrangement, Prudence said to the woman beside her. Her voice carried clear in the cold air. What kind of woman does that? Then she turned and walked toward the church, and the whispers followed her like smoke follows fire. Clara stood alone on the platform. The cold was inside her now, deeper than her coat could reach, deeper than her bones. She had no money, no shelter, no allies, and a clock that had started ticking. 30 days. She sat back down on the bench and pressed her hands together to stop them from shaking. She did not know that she was about to be found. She did not know that the person who would find her would change everything. She only knew that she was alone and cold and running out of places to run. The sound of wheels on frozen ground reached her before she saw the wagon. It came up the main road from the south, a sturdy farm wagon pulled by two draft horses with steam rising from their nostrils. The driver was a woman in her late 20s, bundled in layers against the cold with a determined expression and strong hands on the reins. Beside her on the bench sat a girl of about 6 years old, red-haired and serious with the look of a child who has been listening to adult conversations and understanding more than anyone suspects. Hannah Merritt Dawson pulled the wagon to a stop near the platform. She had come to collect supplies for her husband's blacksmith shop, as she did every other week, bringing her daughter Rosie along for the company, and because Rosie refused to be left behind. Hannah saw Clara immediately. It was not hard. A woman alone on a bench in the freezing cold with nothing but a bag and a look of quiet desperation is not a sight that blends into the background. Hannah had also seen the scene with Drummond. She had been inside the feed store and had watched through the window, and what she had seen had made her jaw tighten in a way her husband recognized as the beginning of a decision that would be made whether anyone agreed with it or not. She climbed down from the wagon and walked to the bench. She did not introduce herself first. She sat down beside Clara the way you sit beside someone at a funeral, close enough to be felt, far enough to leave room for dignity. "You are the woman Drummond brought here," Hannah said. It was not a question. Clara's guard went up. She had learned long ago that people who knew things about her before she told them were rarely offering friendship. "I am not his," Clara said. Hannah studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the kind of nod that accepts a statement, not because it has been proven, but because the person saying it has earned the right to be believed. She asked. Clara did not want to tell, but Hannah had a way of asking that was less like prying and more like holding open a door and waiting. And after a few minutes, Clara found herself saying enough. "Mail order bride, saloon instead of ranch, locked door, escape through a window, no money, no one, nowhere to go." While Clara spoke, Rosie climbed down from the wagon. The girl did not ask permission. She walked straight to Clara, unwound the scarf from her own neck, and wrapped it around Clara's throat. She did it without a word, with the matter-of-fact tenderness of a child who does not yet know that kindness is supposed to come with conditions. Clara's eyes burned. She blinked hard. She had not cried in months, and she would not cry now. But the warmth of that small scarf and the small hands that had placed it there cracked something inside her chest that she had been holding together with nothing but will. Rosie looked up at her with eyes that were too serious for 6 years old. "You are cold," she said simply. Hannah watched this. Whatever decision she had been forming solidified. "I am taking you up the mountain," Hannah said. "My brother has a ranch. He lives alone. Has for 8 years." She paused. "He will not be happy about this. But he will not turn you away, not in winter, not a woman alone." Clara shook her head. "I cannot ask that. I do not even know you. You are not asking." Hannah said, "I am telling." She stood and held out her hand. "And you will know me soon enough. My name is Hannah. This is my daughter Rosie. My brother is Caleb Merritt. He raises cattle and horses on the North Ridge, and he has not smiled in 8 years. Maybe you will not fix that, but at least you will not freeze to death on a bench." The wagon climbed for 3 hours. The road narrowed into a trail. The trail narrowed into a path through scrub oak and sycamore. The mountains rose blue and heavy on the horizon, and the air thinned and sharpened until each breath felt like drinking cold water. Hannah talked. Clara listened. Rosie sat between them, her small body pressed against Clara's side with a trust that Clara had not earned, but that the child seemed to offer without reservation. Hannah told her about Caleb. Not everything. Enough. He had been different once, she said. Open, hopeful. Their father had arranged a marriage for him when he was 27. A girl from Pennsylvania, the daughter of a minister. Caleb had never met her, but he had received letters about her in a portrait, and he had begun to build his hope around the idea of her the way a man builds a house around a hearth. He waited for her, Hannah said, at a hotel in Miller's Crossing. 3 days. Checked every wagon and every rider that came into town. On the third day, a telegram arrived. The girl had died of fever. There would be no wedding. Hannah's voice dropped. He came back to the mountain and he never came down. Not really. He built the cabin, built the fences, runs the ranch alone except for Virgil, a hand who comes seasonal. He talks to his horses more than he talks to people. She glanced at Clara. He keeps a locked wooden box under his bed. I have never seen him open it, but I know what is inside. The portrait, the telegram, the letters, everything he lost before he ever had it. Clara listened to this story and felt something move inside her that she could not name. A recognition, a resonance. The echo of a loss that matched her own in shape, if not in detail. She said nothing. Some stories need to settle before they can be spoken to. The cabin appeared in the late afternoon, tucked against the shoulder of a hill where the land rose quiet and the wind lost its edge. Weathered boards, a roof patched with canvas. The front steps sagged slightly, one shutter hung by a single hinge. But smoke curled from the stovepipe, and the chimney stood straight, and there was a cleanness to the place that spoke of care. Not comfort, not warmth, just care. The careful maintenance of a man who keeps his world in order, because order is the only thing standing between him and the grief he will not name. A man stood on the porch, tall, lean, a beard that had gone past stubble into something deliberate. Gray eyes set deep in a face carved by weather, and years lined beyond his age, though he could not have been older than 35. His hands hung at his sides, scarred across the knuckles from barbed wire, and he watched the wagon approach with the particular stillness of a man who has learned to read trouble in the way things move. Hannah pulled the wagon to a stop. She climbed down and turned to help Clara. Caleb descended the porch steps. His boots crunched on the frozen ground. His eyes moved from Hannah to the wagon to the second figure climbing down, and something changed in his body. A tension, a stillness within the stillness, like a man hearing a sound he recognizes but cannot place. Clara's boots touched the ground. She stumbled, slightly weak from the cold and the long ride, and Hannah caught her arm. Clara steadied herself, straightened her back, lifted her face. And Caleb Merritt looked into her eyes, and the world shifted beneath his feet. Pale blue, the color of a winter sky just before dawn. He knew those eyes. He knew them the way a man knows his own reflection, so familiar that recognition comes before thought. He had looked at those eyes 1,000 times, on a small portrait painted on ivory, in a wooden box under his bed. Eyes that belonged to a girl who had died 8 years ago on the other side of the continent. But the girl was dead, and this woman was alive. And the two things could not be the same. The moment passed, or it seemed to. Caleb blinked, looked away, looked at Hannah with an expression that was part question and part accusation. Hannah spoke fast. She told him about Drummond, the fake advertisement, the saloon, the locked room, the escape. She told him Clara had nowhere to go and no one to turn to, and winter was coming hard, and she would not leave a woman on a bench to freeze. Caleb listened without interrupting. His jaw worked slowly the way it did when he was holding something back. He looked at Clara again, at her hands calloused and red from cold, at her worn boots, at the bruise darkening on her elbow where she had hit the awning, at the straight line of her back unbowed despite everything. He looked at Rosie, who had climbed down and was holding Clara's hand as if she had been doing it for years. Then he nodded, one nod, short and sharp. "She can sleep inside," he said. "I will be in the barn." Clara started to object. He shook his head once. It would not be proper otherwise. He turned and walked toward the barn without another word. His boots left prints in the frost, and his shadow stretched long behind him, and he did not look back. Inside the cabin was dark but clean. One cot against the wall, a stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, one missing a leg, and propped with a block of wood. A shelf with 3 books, a tin cup, and a Bible. Everything simple, everything touched by a kind of careful loneliness, the particular order a man keeps when he has no one to keep it for. Hannah lit the lamp. The soft gold glow pushed back the shadows and made the room feel almost warm. She showed Clara the stove, the water bucket, the kindling box. She hung Clara's coat on the nail by the door and stoked the fire until the iron sides of the stove ticked with heat. Before she left, Hannah pulled Clara aside. Her voice was low and her eyes were serious. "He is a good man," she said. "The best I know, but he has been hurt in a way that did not heal, and he has spent 8 years making sure nothing can hurt him again. Be patient with him, and be honest. He can forgive almost anything except a lie." Clara nodded. Hannah hugged her sudden and tight, the embrace of a woman who makes decisions with her whole body and does not look back. Then she collected Rosie, who clung to Clara for an extra moment, and whispered, "Do not leave before allowing herself to be lifted into the wagon." Clara watched them go. The sound of wheels faded down the trail. Silence closed in. The kind of silence that is not empty but full of wind and distance, and the slow breathing of a world that does not care about human sorrow, but makes room for it anyway. She turned back to the cabin, closed the door, stood in the lamplight with her arms at her seat, and let herself feel for the first time in days something other than fear. The stove crackled, the wind pressed against the walls, and beneath the cot, just visible in the shadow, a wooden box sat with its lid scarred by years of being touched. Night after night, reaching down in the dark, checking that it was still there, the way a man checks a wound that is never fully closed. Clara did not open it. She sat on the edge of the cot and pulled the blanket around her shoulders and stared at the ceiling and listened to the cabin settle and creak. She thought about Drummond and his 30-day deadline. She thought about Prudence Gatewood and her whispered judgment. She thought about Sarah Bowen, whose name was embroidered on a piece of cloth in Clara's coat pocket, and who had left things behind in a room above a saloon and disappeared without anyone noticing or caring. And she thought about the man in the barn, the rancher who had waited 3 days in a hotel for a bride who never came, who had received a telegram that said she was dead. who had locked himself away on a mountain for 8 years with a portrait in a wooden box and a silence that filled his bones. Something stirred inside Clara. Not understanding, not yet. Just the faint shape of a question she could not yet form. A pattern half seen like tracks in snow before the light is strong enough to read them. She had been promised to a man in the Wyoming mountains 8 years ago, a rancher's son. She had never known his name. Caleb Merritt had waited for a bride from Pennsylvania 8 years ago, the daughter of a minister. She had never arrived. Clara pressed her hand against the cot and felt the corner of the wooden box through the thin mattress. Her heart beat slow and heavy in her chest. She did not follow the thought further. Not tonight. Tonight she was alive and warm and the door was not locked, and that was enough. She slept. For the first time in 72 hours, she slept. The days that followed moved slowly, the way days move when two strangers share a space too small for distance and too new for ease. Caleb kept to the barn. He chopped wood, fixed fence, rode out each morning before dawn and returned at dusk, sometimes with jerky or eggs, sometimes with nothing. He never came in without wiping his boots, never spoke louder than necessary, never once acted like she owed him anything. Clara worked. She learned the stove, learned which draft to close at midnight and which to crack at dawn. She cooked cornmeal mush that first morning, simple and plain, but made the way her mother used to make it, and Caleb ate without comment. The next morning, he was at the table 30 minutes earlier than the day before. The morning after that, earlier still. She mended his shirts without being asked, found them draped over the back of a chair worn through at the elbows and cuffs, and repaired them with stitches so small they disappeared into the fabric. When Caleb put on the first mended shirt, he looked at the stitching for a long time, said nothing. But that evening, 3 more shirts appeared on the chair. In the evenings, Clara read aloud from the books on the shelf, a volume of poetry, a history of the territories. She read by lamplight with her voice soft and steady, and Caleb sat in the corner whittling a piece of pine, pretending not to listen. But his hands stopped moving whenever she turned a page. And one evening when she looked up from a passage, she caught him watching her. Not staring, just watching with an expression that mixed confusion with something older and more dangerous. Their eyes met. Color rose in her cheeks. He looked away, but not fast enough. On Saturday, Hannah brought Rosie up the mountain. The girl jumped from the wagon before it stopped and ran, not to her uncle, but to Clara. She pressed herself against Clara's legs and looked up with those 2 serious eyes and said, "I brought you something." It was a ribbon, blue, slightly frayed. Rosie had taken it from her own hair. She held it up to Clara with both hands, a small offering made with the total conviction of a child who believes that gifts can fix anything. Clara knelt. She took the ribbon and held it in her palm and looked at this child who barely knew her but had already decided that knowing was not a requirement for caring. She tied the ribbon in Rosie's hair instead. "It looks better on you," Clara said. Rosie shook her head. "It is for you, so you have something pretty." Behind them, Caleb stood in the barn doorway watching. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. Not because of Rosie, because of the way Clara held the child. Natural, warm, the way a woman holds something small and precious, like she was built for keeping things safe. He turned and went back into the barn, but he stood just inside the door for a long time, one hand on the rough wood frame, staring at nothing. Virgil Tate arrived the following Monday. He came on his own horse, a weathered man of 40, with sun-cracked lips and a squint that measured everything it fell upon. He worked seasonal for Caleb, checking fence and moving cattle, and he had done so for 5 years without once questioning Caleb's judgment. Until now. He saw Clara at the stove and stopped in the doorway. He looked at Caleb. His voice carried no malice but no warmth either. "You brought a woman up here in the middle of winter coming on. More mouths to feed when the snow gets deep. What are you thinking?" Caleb looked at Virgil. Just looked. Did not speak. Looked until the older man went quiet and shifted his weight and found something else to study with his squint. Later, when Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, Virgil walked past. He stopped without looking at her directly. "You know he lost someone," Virgil said. "A woman he was going to marry. She died before they ever met. It broke something in him. 8 years, and he has not let a living soul past the front door of that cabin. Until you." Clara kept her hands on the wet cloth. "I did not ask to be here." No, but you are here, and he let you stay. That means something, whether he knows it yet or not. Virgil walked on. Clara stood with the laundry snapping in the wind and a question settling in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She thought about it through the afternoon. The bride Caleb had waited for, dead of fever, from Pennsylvania, the daughter of a minister. Clara's hand stopped moving on the clothesline. She was the daughter of a minister from Pennsylvania, and 8 years ago her father had sent a telegram saying she was dead. The ground tilted beneath her feet. She gripped the line, her heart hammered. No, it could not be. There were many ministers in Pennsylvania, many daughters, many arrangements that fell apart. But the timing, the location, the description Hannah had given. Clara forced herself to breathe. She was not ready for this thought. Not yet. She needed more. She needed to be certain before she could let herself believe that the man sleeping in the barn 30 feet from her was the same man she had screamed for 8 years ago while beating on a locked door until her hands bled. She folded the laundry, carried it inside, did not ask. Not yet. The second week brought Drummond. He arrived on a clear morning when the sky was sharp and blue and the frost made the grass crunch underfoot like broken glass. Two riders came up the trail, Drummond on his chestnut horse, heavy and well-fed, Deputy Pike behind him, hand near his weapon. Clara was hanging laundry. Caleb was in the barn mending tack. The sound of hooves brought them both outside. Drummond reined in. He looked at the cabin, at the clothesline, at Clara standing beside it with her hands at her sides. He smiled. Well now, Miss Whitfield. He dismounted with a grunt. We have unfinished business. He produced the contract. Her signature, her handwriting. Clara stepped forward. She did not let Caleb stand in front of her. She positioned herself between Drummond and the cabin, and she spoke with a voice that did not waver. I signed a contract to marry a rancher with land and cattle and an honest life. You have no land, you have no cattle. What you call honest is not what I call honest. I am not going to your saloon. Drummond's smile held. 18 days, Miss Whitfield. 18 days left. Then I return with a judge and a court order. Caleb stepped out of the barn. He walked to Clara's side. Not in front of her. Beside her. His hands hung loose. His voice was level. She is on my land. That makes it my concern. Drummond looked at Caleb. The smile remained, but the eyes changed. Mr. Merritt, I have heard about you. The man who lost his bride 8 years ago. Living alone on the mountain since. He let the words settle like dust. Lonely that long, a man might believe anything that comes through his door. Caleb did not respond. He did not need to. His stillness said more than words could. Drummond gathered his reins, turned his horse. But before he rode out of earshot, he called back over his shoulder, his voice clear in the cold air. Ask her about her father, Reverend Whitfield. I knew him better than she thinks. There are things she has not told you, Merritt, things that might change your mind about keeping her here. Then he was gone, dust settling, hoofbeats fading. Clara stood on the porch. Her hand closed around the piece of cloth in her pocket, the one embroidered with the name Sarah Bowen. She had a deadline now, 18 days. She had a man with money and a deputy and a contract that bore her signature. She had a woman named Prudence who was poisoning the town against her before she had even lived in it. And she had a question. Drummond knew her father, knew Reverend Whitfield from Pennsylvania. He knew about the locked room. He knew about the broken engagement. He knew things that a man who placed a mail order advertisement should not know. Why did Drummond know so much about her past? What was the connection between a saloon owner in Wyoming and a dead minister in Pennsylvania? Clara looked at Caleb across the yard. He was looking at her too. The late afternoon light caught the scar on his hand and the gray of his eyes and the lines around them that came from something deeper than weather. And in those eyes she saw it again. The flicker, the recognition he could not explain. The way his gaze kept returning to hers like a compass finding north. She had been sent to him twice now. Once by a father who stole her away. Once by a sister who brought her home. She did not know this yet, not completely, but she felt it. The way you feel a storm before it breaks. The way you feel a truth before you can prove it. Something was coming, something that would change everything. 18 days, 2 enemies, 1 cabin, And between her and the man in the barn, a silence that was starting to sound less like distance and more like the space before a door opens. Clara Whitfield stood on the porch in the fading light and let the cold press against her face and made herself a promise. She would not run again. She had spent 8 years being locked away and lied to and controlled by men who believed that paper and power were the same thing. She was done running. Whatever was coming, she would stand and meet it. She put her hand on the door frame, felt the rough wood under her palm, and went inside to build the fire higher because the night was going to be long and cold, and she had learned a long time ago that the only way to survive the dark was to keep something burning. Part 2. The storm came without warning on the fifth night, the way storms come to places that have already seen too much trouble. Not a blizzard, not yet, but a hard wind that screamed through the valley and shook the cabin walls and tore a section of the east fence clean away. Caleb and Virgil had ridden out that morning to check the cattle at the far pasture. A section of upper fence had come down in an earlier gust, and a dozen head had scattered into the timber. They would be gone all day, maybe into the night. Clara was feeding the stove when she heard it. Not the wind, something beneath the wind. A sound low and urgent, the restless lowing of cattle in distress. Then the crack of splitting wood and the heavy thud of fence posts giving way. She went to the window. In the last gray light, she could see them dark shapes moving through the gap where the east fence had been cattle pushing through into the open dark. She looked at the door, looked at the stove, looked at the tools hanging on the wall of the lean-to that she could see through the window. She grabbed Caleb's spare coat, took the hammer, the coil of barbed wire, and the post driver from the lean-to, lit the lantern, and walked out into the storm. It took her 2 hours. The wind knocked her flat twice. The first time she caught herself on a fence post and tasted dirt. The second time she went down hard on her shoulder and lay in the frozen mud for 5 seconds, staring up at the black sky, feeling the cold seep through her coat and into her skin and into the place behind her ribs where fear lived. Then she got up, because getting up was what she did. It was the only thing she had ever been good at. Falling and getting up and falling and getting up until the falling stopped or she did. She drove stakes with numb hands, twisted wire with fingers that bled before she finished the first post. The barbed wire bit into her palms and left lines of red that the cold turned black. She worked by lantern light, one post at a time, one stretch of wire at a time, pulling it tight and twisting the ends and moving to the next post and doing it again. By dawn, the fence held. Not perfect, not the work of a man who had been doing this for years, but solid enough, tight enough. The cattle that had pushed through were still milling near the gap, but they had not gone far, and the repaired section would hold until someone stronger could reinforce it. Clara sat on the porch step. Her hands were raw and crusted with dried blood. Her face was white beneath the dirt. Her shoulder ached from the fall, and her fingers would not close all the way. She sat and breathed and waited. Caleb and Virgil rode in an hour after sunrise, both of them mud-splattered and hollow-eyed from a night of chasing strays through timber. Caleb saw the fence first. He reined in his horse and sat for a long moment looking at the new wire, the fresh-driven stakes, the blood on the posts where her hands had gripped. Then he looked at Clara on the porch step. He dismounted, walked to the fence, tested the wire with one hand, pulling it, feeling the tension. It held. He turned and looked at her hands, at her face, at the exhaustion that had settled into her body like something permanent. He did not say thank you, did not say well done, did not say a single word of praise. He nodded, one nod, slow and deep, the nod of a man who recognizes something he thought the world had stopped making. Behind him, Virgil sat on his horse and stared at the fence, then at Clara, then at the fence again. His permanent squint had changed, not warm yet, but the skepticism had cracked like ice on a creek in late winter, still there but thinner than before. "You know wire work?" he asked. "I grew up on a farm," Clara said. Virgil nodded slowly. It was the nod of a man revising a long-held opinion and not enjoying the process but doing it anyway because the evidence had left him no choice. That night he ate 2 bowls of her stew and did not complain about a single thing. The following week, Clara needed supplies: flour, salt, thread for mending, a tin of lard if she could find one. Caleb offered to go alone, but Clara shook her head. "I need to see the town," she said. I need to know what we are dealing with. He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. Cedar Hollow looked different in daylight than it had in the frozen dark when Clara had been running through it. Smaller, harder, a town built on the intersection of two roads and the stubbornness of people who had come too far to turn around. The saloon still stood at the center, freshly painted and prosperous, the only building that looked like someone had invested in it. Everything else leaned and sagged with the tired patience of structures that had stopped hoping for repair. Caleb stopped the wagon in front of the general store. Hensley Dry Goods. The faded sign read that Margaret Cope had bought the place 3 years ago and never changed the name. He helped Clara down. His hand stayed on her elbow a moment longer than it needed to. I will be at the feedlot, he said. Do not go near the saloon. She did not intend to. The store smelled of coffee and kerosene and dried apples. Margaret Cope stood behind the counter, a solid woman with gray-streaked hair pulled tight, and the kind of face that had stopped trying to be pretty 30 years ago and settled for honest. She watched Clara enter with eyes that missed nothing and judged only what deserved judging. You are the one staying with Caleb Merritt, Margaret said. I am. Margaret studied her. Then she began pulling items from the shelves without being asked, as if she had already read the list Clara carried in her pocket. Flour, salt, a small cone of sugar wrapped in brown paper. She set them on the counter without tallying prices. The door opened. Cold air and Prudence Gatewood entered together as if the two were related. Prudence stopped when she saw Clara. Her eyes made the same journey they had made at the train station, from boots to hands, to face to collar, cataloging each flaw, each sign of poverty, each piece of evidence that confirmed the story she had already written. So Prudence said, the mail-order bride, living with Mr. Merritt. She let the word living carry the weight she intended. No husband, no marriage. A woman of certain circumstances. She turned to the two churchwomen flanking her and shook her head with practiced sorrow. What this town is coming to. Clara met her eyes. I am a teacher who lost her position, Mrs. Gatewood. I am living in the only safe place available to me. Your husband is the judge in this county. You must understand the law well enough to know there is nothing illegal about a woman renting a room. Prudence's face tightened. The color in her cheeks rose. Clara's response had been the worst kind, calm and measured and correct, the kind of answer that a woman like Prudence could not refute without revealing that her objection was not about law, but about power. My husband will be presiding over your case, dear, Prudence said. Her voice was honey poured over broken glass. I would be careful about the impression you make. She turned and swept toward the back of the store, her attendants following. Margaret Cope stepped close. Her voice was low and fast. Listen to me. Drummond is telling everyone you belong to him, that you signed a contract and ran. Prudence is his loudest trumpet. She has been whispering to every woman in the church that you are living in sin with Caleb, and that you are the kind of woman who brings shame to a decent community. Clara started to speak, but Margaret held up a hand. I know it is not true, but the truth does not matter if the judge's wife is the one telling the lies. You need to be careful. She paused. And there is something else you need to know. Margaret leaned closer. Her eyes were serious in a way that went beyond gossip or concern. Before you, there were at least 3 other women. Drummond brought them all here the same way. Advertisements, letters, promises of a ranch and an honest life. The first 2 figured it out fast and ran. One went east, one went south. But the third, Margaret's voice dropped. The third was a young woman named Sarah Bowen. She arrived in the spring of '79. She worked in the saloon for 4 months. Then she disappeared. No one saw her leave. No one heard from her again. Clara felt the cloth in her pocket. The embroidered name, Sarah Bowen, found in the drawer of the room where Clara had been locked. Margaret slid the bag of supplies across the counter and tucked something extra inside. A small sack of sugar and a packet of dried apple slices. For yourself, she said. And Clara, she squeezed her hand. You are not alone, even if it feels that way. Clara carried the supplies to the wagon. Caleb was waiting, leaning against the wheel, watching the street with the stillness of a man who reads danger in the way people walk. When Clara climbed up beside him, he saw her face. What happened? She told him. Prudence, the whispers, the church women. He listened without interrupting, his jaw working slowly. You do not need their approval, he said. No, but I need them not to have the power to send me back to Drummond. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw him understand the shape of her fear in a way that words alone could not have carved. They rode in silence. Halfway home, Clara noticed fresh hoofprints in the mud around the cabin, the barn door standing open by a hand's width. Inside, nothing taken, nothing broken, but on the table, weighted down by a stone, a piece of paper. Contract expires in 16 days. Come back or I come for you. The handwriting was Drummond's. Neat, unhurried, the hand of a man who had all the time in the world. Clara folded the note and put it in her pocket with the cloth. Evidence she was building a collection. Winter closed its fist around the cabin in the weeks that followed. The creek ran sluggish and cold. Ice formed along its edges in sheets that cracked under the weight of a drinking cup. The road to town disappeared under snow. The world shrank to the size of the cabin, the barn, and the space between them. In that small space, something grew. Clara noticed it in details so small they might have been imagined. The way Caleb saved the best cuts of jerky for her, but always made sure she ate before he did. The way he checked the doors and windows 3 times each night before sleeping. The way he hummed when he mended fence, a tuneless murmur that was not music but was not nothing either. And the way he paused whenever she laughed, even at some small thing, and held still as if the sound deserved to be heard completely before the world could move again. She noticed it in herself, too. The way her hand lingered on his arm when she passed him coffee in the morning, a touch that lasted a heartbeat longer than necessary. The way she listened for his boots on the porch each evening and felt something loosen in her chest when she heard them. The way she caught herself watching him through the window as he worked, the way his shoulders moved. When he swung the axe, the way he pulled his hat low against the sun and squinted at the horizon as if looking for something he had lost. One evening, when the wind pressed soft against the walls and the fire crackled low, Clara sat beside the stove and spoke about her past. She had not planned to. The words came the way water comes through a crack in a dam, slowly at first, and then all at once. She told him about her father, Reverend Whitfield, a minister with a congregation and a reputation and a need for control that grew larger every year after her mother died. She told him about the locked doors and the measured words and the belief drilled into her since childhood that her worth was calculated solely by her obedience. She told him about the engagement. 8 years ago, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it filled the small cabin. My father arranged a marriage for me with a rancher's son in the Wyoming mountains. I had never met him, never been told his name, only that he lived in Wyoming and raised horses. She paused. The fire popped. A log shifted. I was terrified, she said, and I was thrilled. For the first time in my life, I had a chance to leave, to be someone other than Reverend Whitfield's obedient daughter. I dared to hope that the man waiting for me might be kind. She looked at her hands, rough hands, working hands, hands that had beaten against a locked door until they bled. My father changed his mind. Another man had made an offer, wealthier, from our own town, more useful to my father's ambitions. On the day I was supposed to travel to meet my intended, my father locked me in my room, and he sent a telegram to the man in Wyoming saying that I had died of fever. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. I screamed, Clara said. I beat on the door until my hands were raw. I called out for someone to help me. No one came. She told him the rest. The wealthy suitor who died before the wedding. The years of punishment that followed. Her father's death 2 years ago. Her freedom hard won and late arriving. The teaching position. The closed school. The advertisement that brought her here. And through all of it, she said, I thought about him. The man in the mountains. I wondered if he hated me for never coming. If he cursed my name. If he found happiness with someone else. I carried the guilt of a broken promise I was never allowed to keep. Caleb had not moved during the telling. He sat in his chair with his hands gripping the armrests and his face drawn tight like a man hearing the sound of a door he had locked long ago beginning to open. His breathing had changed. His knuckles were white. When she finished, the room was so quiet she could hear his heartbeat. Or maybe it was her own. He spoke. His voice came out rough, barely recognizable. What town, he asked. Where your father was minister. She told him. He closed his eyes. And the man he arranged for you to marry. You never knew his name. She shook her head. only that he lived in the Wyoming mountains and raised horses. Caleb stood. The chair scraped against the floor. He crossed the room to the cot and knelt beside it. His hands were shaking so badly he had trouble gripping the wooden box beneath the frame. He pulled it out, opened the lid. Inside was an envelope yellowed with age and a small portrait painted on ivory. He held both for a moment, looking at them the way a man looks at a wound he has been tending for years, familiar and painful, and too much a part of him to put down. He handed them to Clara without a word. She opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in her father's distinctive handwriting, the careful script she knew better than her own, describing his daughter Clara and offering her in marriage to one Caleb Merritt of the Wyoming Territory. Her hands began to tremble. She looked at the portrait, a young woman of 18 with autumn-colored hair and pale blue eyes painted by a traveling artist who had visited her father's congregation the year before the engagement. Clara recognized herself, younger, softer, before the locked room, before the years of punishment, before she learned that the world was not kind and that the only person she could depend on was herself. She looked up. Caleb was kneeling in front of her, close enough to touch, his gray eyes filled with something that had been locked away for 8 years and was now breaking through like water through a dam. The silence was the loudest thing in the room. "You were sent to me twice," Clara whispered. The words came without thought, pulled from some deep place that understood before her mind caught up. "Once by a father who stole me away, and once by a sister who brought me home." Caleb told her. The 3 days in Miller's Crossing. The hotel room he had paced until the floorboards groaned. Every wagon checked, every rider studied. The telegram on the 3rd day. 6 words that had ended his life as surely as a bullet. Girl dead of fever. No wedding. He told her about this ride back to the mountain, the way the sky had looked, the way the air had tasted, the way he had dismounted and walked into the cabin and closed the door and not opened it again for anyone except Hannah for 8 years. He told her about the portrait he had kept in the box, the portrait he looked at on the darkest nights, tracing the lines of a face he had never touched and mourning a life he had never lived. He told her he had never sought another bride, never wanted one, because the wanting had been killed by a telegram from a place he had never been about a girl he had never met, and the only thing left was the ache, and the ache was all he had of her, and he could not let it go, because letting it go meant she had never existed at all. His voice broke on the last words, not dramatically, not with the theatrical crack of a man performing grief. Just a small fracture, the sound of something that has been carrying weight for too long, finally admitting that the weight is real. Clara reached out. She placed her hand on his chest. Beneath her palm, his heart pounded with a force that shook his ribs. Steady and hard, and very much alive. He lifted one hand and touched her face. His fingers were rough against her cheek, rough from wire and wood, and years of work done alone. He wiped the tears she did not know she had shed. The gesture was so gentle, it made her chest ache. She leaned into his hand. He put his arm around her waist. They stayed that way, kneeling on the floor of a cold cabin in the Wyoming mountains, holding each other with the careful intensity of 2 people who had been broken and were not yet whole but were beginning to believe that wholeness was possible. They did not kiss. The moment was too full, too heavy with the weight of 8 lost years and the impossible mathematics of fate. They held each other, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Later, after Caleb had gone to the barn and Clara lay on the cot listening to the wind, she reached for the wooden box one more time. She needed to see the telegram again. She held it close to the lamp. Girl dead of fever. No wedding. The words were stark and simple and devastating. But it was the signature that stopped her breath. W. Office. She had assumed, as anyone would, that this was an abbreviation for Whitfield Office, her father's study, his personal letterhead. But she knew her father's correspondence better than anyone alive. Reverend Whitfield never abbreviated. He signed every letter, every document, every note with his full name and title. It was a matter of pride with him, a small vanity he disguised as professionalism. W. Office was not Whitfield Office. It could not be. Clara turned the telegram over, held it at an angle. The paper was old and the ink had faded, but the imprint of the sending station was still faintly visible in the lower corner. She squinted. The letters were small and smudged, but she could make out the first word. Western Office. A telegraph office. Not in Pennsylvania, somewhere in the West. Someone in the West had sent this telegram to Caleb Merritt 8 years ago telling him his bride was dead. Clara sat up. Her mind moved fast, connecting pieces that had been floating in the dark for weeks. Drummond had lived in Pennsylvania before coming to Cedar Hollow. Doc Prentice had mentioned it in passing during the town visit, a small detail that had lodged in Clara's memory like a splinter. Drummond knew her father, had said so himself standing in the yard with his pleasant smile and his cold eyes. I knew Reverend Whitfield, knew him better than she thinks. Drummond had come to Wyoming about 9 years ago, 1 year before the telegram was sent. 1 year before Clara was locked in a room and Caleb was told she was dead. The connections aligned like fence posts in a straight line, one after another, each one supporting the next. Drummond knew her father. Drummond came to Wyoming. The telegram came from the West. Drummond had been bringing mail-order brides to Cedar Hollow for years, women lured by false promises, women who arrived and found a saloon instead of a ranch. And Clara had been one of them, not by accident, not by chance, because Drummond knew who she was, knew she was vulnerable, knew exactly which words to write to make her sign a contract and board a train. He had not found her at random. He had found her on purpose. And if he had sent the telegram 8 years ago, then he was not just a man who deceived women. He was the man who had stolen 8 years from Clara and Caleb. 8 years of silence and grief and locked rooms and lonely mountains. 8 years of two people mourning each other without knowing the other was alive. Clara held the telegram in both hands. She did not shake. She did not cry. Something harder than tears had settled in her chest. Something with teeth. She placed the telegram back in the box, closed the lid. She would need it. Not yet, but soon. 10 days. That was how long she had before the hearing. 10 days to build a case against a man who had money and a deputy and a contract with her name on it. 10 days to prove that the contract was built on lies. And now possibly 10 days to prove that the lies went back 8 years further than anyone suspected. She lay back on the cot. She did not sleep, but she closed her eyes and let her mind work, sorting and arranging and building the way she had built that fence in the storm. One post at a time, one wire at a time. The next blow came 3 days later. A hired buggy appeared on the trail, moving slowly through the half-melted snow with Deputy Pike riding alongside. The man who stepped down from the buggy was tall and thin, dressed in a dark suit that was cut too well for Wyoming territory, with a watch chain across his vest and a leather briefcase that cost more than most ranchers earned in a month. His face was narrow and clean-shaved and careful, the face of a man who measured everything before he touched it. Emmett Farwell, lawyer, from Pennsylvania. He stood in the yard and looked at the cabin the way a man looks at something he intends to condemn. His eyes moved from the sagging porch to the patched roof to the single window. Then they moved to Clara, standing in the doorway with her arms at her sides. "Miss Whitfield," he said. His voice was polite, practiced. The courtesy of a man who had learned that manners were a weapon more effective than any raised fist. "I am Emmett Farwell. I represent your aunt, Mrs. Adelaide Price, your mother's sister." Clara felt the ground shift. She had not heard her aunt's name spoken aloud in years. Adelaide Price had never written to her, not when Clara's mother died, not when Clara's father locked her away, not once in 27 years. The woman existed in Clara's memory only as an absence, a door that should have opened and never did. "I have filed a petition for guardianship of the estate left by Reverend Whitfield." Farwell continued. He reached into his briefcase and produced a document. Folded, official, the church property, the parsonage land, and a sum of money from the recent sale of adjacent acreage that was part of the estate. "As your nearest living relative through your mother's line, Mrs. Price believes she is best positioned to manage these assets." Clara did not move. "My aunt has never once contacted me. Not when I was hungry, not when I was locked in a room, not when I was homeless. The only thing that has changed is that my father's land is worth something. She is not here for me. She is here for dirt." Farwell's expression did not change. He had the trained composure of a man who argued for a living and did not rattle easily. "The court will decide what is best, Miss Whitfield, not sentiment." He looked past her at the cabin. "A judge will want to know why you are living in a one-room cabin with a man who is not your husband and who has no legal standing as your guardian." Caleb stepped from the barn. He walked toward Farwell with the same unhurried gait he used for everything, the gait of a man who does not rush because rushing tells the world it can make you afraid. He stopped beside Clara but did not step in front of her. Farwell studied him. Then he turned back to Clara. The hearing is set for 10 days from now. Both matters will be heard together. Mr. Drummond's contract claim and my client's guardianship petition, Judge Gatewood presiding. He placed the document on the porch railing. I suggest you find legal counsel, Miss Whitfield. You will need it. He climbed back into the buggy. Deputy Pike followed. The sound of wheels on frozen ground faded down the trail. Clara stood on the porch until the buggy disappeared. Then she felt a presence beside her. Not Caleb, smaller. She looked down. She had not heard Hannah's wagon arrive. But Hannah was there, having come up for a weekend visit, and Rosie stood beside Clara, her small hand finding Clara's fingers and wrapping around them with a grip that was stronger than a 6-year-old's hand had any right to be. The girl looked up at Clara with those two serious eyes. Is the bad man going to take you away? Clara knelt. She took Rosie's face in both hands, calloused palms against soft cheeks. No one is taking me anywhere, she said, but her hands trembled. Because she knew that promises and power were not the same thing, and the men circling her had far more of the latter than she did. Margaret Cope arrived later that day on her mule-red face from the cold. The news she brought confirmed what Clara already feared. They are working together, Margaret said. Drummond and Farwell, meeting in the saloon, 3 times this week. And Prudence is telling every woman in Cedar Hollow that the court will put things right. She is speaking as though the verdict has already been decided. Clara looked at Caleb. His face was stone. Then the blizzard came. It arrived on a night so dark and so cold that the trees in the forest cracked like gunshots, and the wind screamed through the valley with a voice that sounded almost human. Snow fell sideways, driven into drifts that rose to the windowsills in hours. The temperature dropped so fast that the water in the bucket by the stove froze solid before midnight. Caleb had ridden out that afternoon to move the cattle to the sheltered draw on the south side of the ridge. Virgil was supposed to meet him at the upper pasture. They would bring the herd down together. It should have taken 4 hours. Darkness came, then the storm, and Caleb did not return. Clara waited, fed the stove, checked the window every 10 minutes, pressing her face against the cold glass and seeing nothing but white. She told herself he knew these mountains, told herself he had survived worse, told herself that a man who had endured 8 years of solitary winters knew how to read weather and find shelter. She told herself these things until the door burst open at midnight and Caleb fell through it. He did not walk through. He fell. His face was blue-white, his lips cracked and bleeding. His hands were claws frozen around reins he could no longer feel. Ice hung from his eyebrows and his beard. He had been in the saddle for hours in conditions that should have killed him, and the only reason they had not was that his horse knew the way home even when he could no longer guide it. Clara caught him before he hit the floor. His weight drove her to her knees. He was shaking so violently she could barely hold him, every muscle in his body contracting against the cold that had penetrated past his skin and into his core. She dragged him to the stove, stripped his frozen coat, wrapped him in every blanket she could find, built the fire until the stovepipe glowed red and the cabin walls sweated with heat. She boiled water and pressed hot cloths against his chest and his hands and his feet, working with the focused urgency of a woman who has decided that death will not be permitted in this house tonight. In the early hours, the fever came. His temperature swung from frozen to burning in the space of an hour, and he began to speak in the delirium that sits between consciousness and something darker. He called out names: his sister, his father. Names Clara did not know, and then he called one name that stopped her heart. Clara Whitfield. Not Clara, the full name, the name in her father's letter. The name of the bride he had mourned for 8 years. He said it the way a man says a prayer, the way a man calls to someone he believes is already gone, with a tenderness so raw it burned to hear. Even in delirium, even in the fever's grip, he was still reaching for her, for the girl in the portrait, for the life he had lost. And he did not know, could not know in that broken state that the girl and the woman kneeling beside him were the same person, that the face he had traced on ivory 1,000 lonely nights was now inches from his own, alive and real, and refusing to let him go. Clara did not wait for the fever to decide. She pulled on Caleb's second coat, the thin one. She took the lantern. She went to the barn and saddled the horse with hands that shook so badly, the buckles took twice as long. The horse stamped and blew steam and did not want to go out into the screaming white world beyond the barn door. Clara spoke to it the way her father had taught her to speak to frightened animals before he became a man who frightened things instead of calming them. Low and steady, firm and kind. She rode. 5 hours through a blizzard that tried to kill her at every turn. 5 hours of wind and ice and snow so thick she could not see the horse's ears. She followed the road by memory and instinct in the desperate mathematics of a woman who has lost too much to lose again. Twice she nearly went off the trail. Once the horse stumbled and she was thrown forward against the saddle horn so hard the breath left her body. She held on. She kept riding. She reached Cedar Hollow at dawn. The town was buried in white. She rode straight to Doc Prentice's house and pounded on the door until the old man appeared, 62 years old and thin as a broomstick, squinting against the snow glare with a medical bag already in his hand because a doctor in a frontier town learns to answer his door prepared. Clara did not explain. She said 2 words, Caleb Merritt, and Doc Prentice understood. They rode back together, Doc on his own horse, Clara on Caleb's. The return trip took 6 hours because the storm had worsened and the drifts had deepened, and Doc was old and his horse was slower. But they made it. Doc went to work immediately. His hands shook, but his eyes were sharp. He listened to Caleb's chest, mixed a tincture from bottles in his bag, packed hot cloths around the sick man's torso, and elevated his head and told Clara to keep the stove burning as hot as she could stand. Hours passed. The fever raged. Then it broke. Slowly, like a wave pulling back from shore, the heat left Caleb's body. His breathing steadied. His color returned. His eyes opened and found Clara's face, and he let out a sound that was not quite a word, but was unmistakably recognition. Clara knelt before him. She took his hands, still swollen and raw from the cold, and held them against her chest. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his and wept. Not the quiet tears of relief, the deep shaking sobs of a woman who had ridden 5 hours through a killing blizzard because the man she had waited 8 years to find was dying in a cabin on a mountain, and she would not allow it. She would not allow the universe to take him from her twice. His arms came up around her, slow and stiff. He held her, and they stayed that way until the shaking stopped and the fire crackled warm and the worst had passed. Doc Prentice waited until they separated, then spoke quietly near the stove. The hearing is in 7 days, he said. Drummond is pressing the judge. Farwell is providing the legal framework. He paused, then dropped his voice lower. And there is something I have been carrying for too long about Sarah Bowen. I know what happened to her, and I will tell it when the time comes. Not before, not to Drummond, to the court. Clara looked at the old man. His hands were shaking, but his eyes were steady. 2 nights later, Caleb had recovered enough to sit on the porch. The storm had passed. The sky was clear, and the stars were hard and bright, scattered across the black like chips of ice. Clara sat beside him. Their shoulders almost touched. The cold was sharp, but neither of them moved to go inside. I have been thinking, Caleb said, about the hearing, about how to protect you legally. Clara waited. A married woman has rights that an unmarried woman living on someone else's land does not. If we married before the hearing, Drummond could not claim a woman who already has a husband. And the court would see you in a stable home on legally filed land with a partner who has standing in this territory. Clara turned to look at him. Is that the reason Caleb met her eyes? The careful reserve he had worn like armor since the day she arrived was gone. His face was open in a way she had not seen before, stripped bare, the face of a man who has decided that the risk of being seen is smaller than the cost of staying hidden. No, he said, that is not the reason. It is the truth the law would see. But the reason is that I waited 8 years for a woman I thought was dead, and she was alive the whole time, and she found me anyway, and I do not want to spend another day pretending that the only thing between us is a legal arrangement. I do not want a savior, Clara said. I am not one, but I have 2 hands and I know how to build. I do not want to marry out of fear. Then do not. Marry because you want to. The snow was falling again, soft, straight down, no wind. It gathered on his shoulders and caught in her hair and melted on her eyelashes. I want to, she said. He reached out and brushed a snowflake from her cheek with the rough pat of his thumb. The touch was so tender it made her chest ache. They did not kiss. Not then. The moment was too full for anything more. They stood in the snow and looked at each other, and what passed between them was not a contract or an arrangement or a strategy for a courtroom, but a choice, made freely, by two people who had learned the difference between need and chose want anyway. That night, for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Clara slept without listening for footsteps outside the door. She woke before dawn. The cabin was cold. The stove had burned low. She went to the barn to find Caleb. He was not there. The horse was gone. His saddle was gone. His coat was gone. Only the thin smell of hay and the warmth of where the horse had stood remained. On the table inside the cabin, held down by the same stone Drummond had used for his threatening note, was a piece of paper, Caleb's handwriting rough and slanting. "There is something I must do before I can stand beside you at that hearing. I will be back. Trust me." Clara read it twice, 3 times. She held the paper in both hands and felt the familiar tremor that came whenever someone she depended on walked through a door without saying when they would return. Every man she had ever trusted had left. Her father had locked her away and then died without unlocking the door of his own cruelty. The husband she was promised had been stolen by a telegram. Drummond had used words like ranch and honest life to lure her into a cage. And now Caleb. She sat at the table for a long time. Dawn came through the window and found her there still holding the note. She had a choice. She could collapse. She could let the fear and the exhaustion and the weight of everything that had happened pull her under. She could sit at this table and wait for someone else to save her the way she had waited in a locked room for 8 years. Or she could stand up. Clara stood up. She folded the note, put it in her pocket with the telegram and the threatening note from Drummond and the embroidered cloth from Sarah Bowen. She sat back down, lit the lamp, took out paper and the stub of a pencil, and she began to build. She wrote down everything. The letters from Drummond with their false promises of ranch and honest life, the contract she had signed and the laws it was built upon, the telegram with its W office signature, Margaret's account of the 4 brides, 2 who fled and 1 who vanished, the piece of cloth with Sarah Bowen's name, Drummond's threatening notes, Farwell's petition and the aunt who had never written, the homestead that Caleb had not yet filed, the one legal gap that still needed closing. She organized them, numbered them, built her case the way she had built the fence in the storm, one post at a time, with bleeding hands and no help and the knowledge that failure was not something she could afford. She did not have a lawyer. She did not have money. She did not have the judge's wife on her side, or the deputy's badge, or the weight of a man's name on a property deed. She had the truth, and she had herself. She worked through the first night and the second. By the second evening, her eyes burned and her hand cramped around the pencil, and the pages were stacked in careful order beside the lamp. Hannah brought Rosie up on the second day. The girl found Clara at the table, hollow-eyed and pale, surrounded by papers. Rosie did not ask what was happening. She climbed onto the chair beside Clara and leaned her head against Clara's shoulder and sat in silence for a long time. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet but certain, the voice of a child who has carried too much and learned too early that carrying is what you do when there is no one else. "You are stronger than you think, Miss Clara." Clara looked at this girl, 6 years old, red-haired, serious as a judge and braver than most adults Clara had ever known. She put her arm around Rosie and held her close and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly, something before hope, the foundation on which hope might one day be built. She picked up the pencil and kept writing. By dawn of the 3rd day, the case was built. The papers were stacked. The evidence was ordered. The arguments were formed. Clara looked out the window at the pale light spreading over the snow. 5 days until the hearing. Caleb gone. Enemies circling. No allies but a shopkeeper, an old doctor who had promised to speak, and a 6-year-old girl who believed in her. She had run from a saloon window in the dark. She had fixed a fence in a blizzard with bare hands. She had ridden 5 hours through a killing storm to bring a doctor to a dying man. She had done all of it without anyone telling her she could. She could do this too. Clara Whitfield sat at the table in the growing light, picked up the pencil, and began to sharpen it with a kitchen knife. She had work to do, and she was not done yet. Part 3, Caleb came back on the third morning. Clara heard the horse before she saw it. She was standing at the stove, heating water for coffee she had made from the last grounds in the tin, stretching them thin, the way you stretch everything when you do not know what is coming next. The sound reached her through the cabin walls like a pulse traveling through stone. She set the pot down, wiped her hands on her apron, walked to the door and opened it. He was coming up the trail on foot, leading the horse because the animal was spent and could carry no more. A second figure walked beside him, shorter, thinner, bundled against the cold in a coat that had seen 30 winters. Doc Prentice. The old man carried his medical bag in one hand and a leather satchel in the other, and he moved with the stiff determination of a person who has made a decision and intends to see it through regardless of what it costs him. Caleb looked like he had not slept in 2 days. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his beard had thickened beyond stubble into something rough and dark. His hands were raw from the cold, but his back was straight and his step was sure, and when he saw Clara standing in the doorway, something in his face changed. Not a smile, something before a smile. The ground on which a smile might one day be built. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. "I am sorry I left without telling you why," he said. Clara came down the steps. She stood in front of him with her arms crossed, not in anger, in the way of a woman holding herself together until she knows whether she can let go. "You are here," she said. "That is enough." He reached into his coat and pulled out 2 documents. The first was a single sheet of paper bearing Doc Prentice's signature and an official county seal. A medical affidavit. Clara took it and read, "I, Dr. James Prentice, practicing physician of Cedar Hollow, Wyoming Territory, do hereby provide the following sworn testimony regarding events of October 1879. On the night of October 14th, a young woman identifying herself as Sarah Bowen presented at my office at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning. She exhibited severe bruising to the face, a sprained left wrist, and marks on her neck consistent with his strangulation. She stated that Silas Drummond had attacked her when she attempted to leave his employ at the Cedar Hollow Saloon. She stated that Mr. Drummond told her, and I quote, "No one leaves." She expressed fear for her life. I provided her with funds from my personal savings and arranged her departure on a freight wagon before dawn. I failed to report this incident to any authority due to fear of reprisal from Mr. Drummond. I attest to the truth of this account under penalty of perjury. Clara looked at Doc Prentice. The old man stood with his hands in his coat pockets and his chin tucked against the wind. He met her eyes without flinching. "Should have written that 3 years ago," he said. "Fear makes cowards of us all. Drummond has had this town under his thumb so long, most of us forgot we had spines." Clara folded the affidavit and held it against her chest. Evidence, real evidence, sworn and sealed. The second document was a land claim. Caleb had ridden to the county recorder's office and filed a formal homestead petition for the cabin and the surrounding 160 acres. It was stamped and dated and signed by the clerk. Not full ownership yet. That would take years of improvement. But it was legal. It was on record. It gave Clara and the cabin an address, a home recognized by the territory of Wyoming. "You did this for the hearing," Clara said. "I did it because it should have been done a long time ago," Caleb said. "A man ought to put his name on the place he means to stay." Clara looked at him, at his tired eyes and his cracked hands and the snow melting on his shoulders. She wanted to say something large enough to hold everything she felt, but language was too small for it. So she stepped forward and took his hands and held them between hers, and he understood. Doc Prentice cleared his throat. "The hearing is in 2 days," he said. "We should talk about what to expect." Margaret Cope arrived an hour later on her mule carrying a basket of bread and wearing the expression of a woman who has come to fight. The 4 of them sat around the table in the cabin while the stove crackled and the wind pressed against the walls. Doc laid out what he knew. Drummond had hired a claims adjuster from Helena to present his contract case. Not a proper lawyer, but a man who knew contract law well enough to be dangerous. Farwell would represent himself on the guardianship petition, which meant he was either confident in his position or too cheap to share the spoils. Judge Orrin Gatewood would preside. Prudence's husband. That was bad. But Gatewood was also a man who had spent decades on the bench and took the law seriously, which might be good. The 2 cases would be heard together. Drummond's claim that Clara was bound by her marriage contract, Farwell's petition for guardianship of her father's estate. Clara spread her papers on the table. Everything she had built during the 2 nights alone. The original letters from Drummond with their promises of ranch and honest life. The marriage contract with her signature and his. The threatening notes left on the cabin table. Margaret's knowledge of the 4 brides. Doc's affidavit about Sarah Bowen. The embroidered cloth found in the saloon room. The homestead filing. And the telegram. The telegram with W office and the connection to Drummond that she could not yet prove but could lay before a judge and let the facts speak. She walked them through her case point by point. Her voice was steady. Her arguments were clear. She had no legal training, but she had spent her life listening to a father who used words as weapons, and she had learned from him not how to manipulate, but how language worked, how evidence built upon evidence, how a case was constructed from the ground up, like a fence that needed to hold against a storm. When she finished, Doc leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. Margaret nodded slowly, her jaw set. Caleb sat still. His hands were on his knees. He was watching Clara with an expression that had moved past admiration into something that looked like awe. The same look he had given the mended fence after the storm. The look of a man watching someone build something that should not be possible with the materials at hand. "There is one more thing," Clara said. She held up the telegram. "This was sent to Caleb 8 years ago. It says I died of fever, but the signature is W, office, not my father's name. And the sending station is marked Western, which means it was sent from somewhere in the West, not from Pennsylvania." She looked around the table. "Drummond lived in Pennsylvania before he came here. He knew my father. He told me so himself. He came to Cedar Hollow approximately 9 years ago. 1 year before this telegram was sent. I cannot prove he sent it, but I can put these facts in front of a judge and let the court draw its own conclusions." The room was silent. Then Doc spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "If that is true," he said, "then Drummond did not just deceive you with a mail order advertisement. He destroyed 2 lives 8 years before you ever signed that contract." "Yes," Clara said, "that is exactly what I intend to show the court." Morning came hard and bright. The kind of morning that does not care what you have planned and offers sunlight and cold in equal measure and leaves you to sort out which one matters more. Clara dressed in her best clothes, which were also her only good clothes. A dark cotton dress she had pressed with a heated iron the night before. Her hair pinned tight, her boots cleaned of mud. She did not look wealthy or powerful or connected. She looked like exactly what she was. A woman who had climbed out of a saloon window and fixed a fence in a blizzard and ridden 5 hours through a killing storm and built a legal case on a kitchen table with a pencil stub and kitchen string. A woman who was still standing. Caleb appeared from the barn in a clean shirt with his collar scrubbed and his boots shined for the first time since Clara had known him. He had trimmed his beard and combed his hair, and the effect was startling. Not handsome in the way the word is usually meant. Something better, solid, present, a man who had put on his best because the occasion demanded it and who wore it without apology. They took the wagon. Caleb drove. Clara sat beside him with her papers in her lap, bound with kitchen string, the pencil stub in her pocket like a talisman. Virgil Tate met them at the edge of the trail. He was riding his own horse wearing a coat that looked like it had been brushed for the first time in its life. His hat was new, or at least newer than the one he usually wore. His face was freshly shaved and pink from the razor. Clara looked at him. "You do not have to do this." Virgil shifted in his saddle. He was not a man comfortable with gestures. What he said came out rough, like words dragged across gravel. "I have watched you mend fence in a storm with your bare hands bleeding. I have seen you ride through a blizzard to save a man's life. I have eaten your cooking when you barely had enough for yourself." He paused. "If the court needs someone to say what I have seen, I will say it." They rode to town together. A wagon, 2 horses, and 4 people who had nothing in common except the belief that the truth spoken clearly and without flinching might be enough to defeat the money and the lease and the law arranged against them. The courthouse stood on the south side of the town square, a plain building of white painted wood with a flat roof and a flagpole where the territorial flag hung limp in the windless morning. It was the most official building in Cedar Hollow, which was not saying much, but it had a certain gravity that came from the things that happened inside it. Lives decided. Fate sealed. Justice attempted, if not always achieved. The courtroom was full. Word had traveled through the town the way it always does in small places, carried on the breath of gossip and the currents of genuine concern. Ranchers and shopkeepers filled the benches. Wives sat beside husbands who had come to see how the law would handle a situation that had been discussed in every kitchen and every stable for weeks. Prudence Gatewood sat in the front row, her back straight as a church pew, her cameo brooch at her throat radiating the confidence of a woman who believed the outcome was already decided. The church auxiliary women flanked her like a personal guard. Silas Drummond sat at the plaintiff's table on the right beside a thin man with spectacles and a stack of papers who had to be the claims adjuster from Helena. Drummond was dressed in his best suit, scrubbed pink hair, oiled flat. He looked like a man playing a part in a play he had rehearsed. Emmett Farwell sat at a separate table alone. His dark suit was too well cut for Wyoming territory. His leather briefcase sat open before him with documents arranged in precise rows. He did not look at Clara when she entered. He did not look at anyone. He looked at his papers with the cold focus of a man who had reduced human beings to entries in a ledger. Clara walked to the respondent's table on the left. She carried no briefcase. She had a small stack of papers tied with kitchen string and the stub of a pencil in her pocket. Caleb sat behind her in the gallery. Doc Prentice sat 3 rows back, clutching his medical bag. Margaret was near the door with Virgil beside her. Hannah sat with Rosie on her lap, the girl's eyes wide and serious, taking in everything. Judge Orrin Gatewood entered through a side door. He was tall and thin in the way that age makes men thin, with white hair and a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete 50 years ago and had not moved since. He wore no robe, just a dark coat and a white shirt, and the bearing of a man who understood that the law was larger than the people who practiced it. He struck the gavel once. The room fell silent. "We are here on 2 matters," he said. "A contract enforcement claim filed by Mr. Silas Drummond and a guardianship petition filed by Mr. Emmett Farwell on behalf of Mrs. Adelaide Price. Both concern Miss Clara Whitfield." He looked at Clara. "Miss Whitfield, you have no legal counsel." "No, sir," Clara said. "I will speak for myself." A murmur moved through the room. Gatewood silenced it with a look. "Very well. Mr. Drummond, present your claim." The claims adjuster stood. He was efficient and dry, and he laid out the case with the mechanical precision of a man assembling a clock. Clara Whitfield had entered into a marriage contract with Silas Drummond on the 12th of September, 1887. She had accepted passage to Wyoming territory. She had agreed to the terms. She had failed to fulfill her obligations. Mr. Drummond sought enforcement of the contract and the return of his contracted bride. The adjuster placed the contract on the judge's bench. Clara's signature was there at the bottom, clear as a wound. Gatewood studied the document. Then he looked at Clara. "Your response, Miss Whitfield." Clara stood. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against the table until they stopped. Then she picked up her papers and stepped forward. "Your Honor, I signed that contract. I do not deny it. I signed it in a cold room in a boarding house in Pennsylvania with no money, no family, and no future I could see. I signed it because Mr. Drummond wrote me letters." She held up the stack. 11 letters. In these letters, he described a ranch, a homestead, land and cattle, and an honest life. He wrote about clean air and open spaces. He wrote about wanting a partner, not a servant. He wrote that he respected a woman who works hard. She paused. Let the courtroom hear the silence. "There is no ranch," she said. "Mr. Drummond owns a saloon. There are no cattle. There is no homestead. Every promise in these letters was a lie designed to bring me here under false pretenses. I signed a contract for a life that does not exist. A contract built on deception is not a contract. It is a trap." The room stirred. Drummond's face reddened. The claims adjuster started to rise, but Gatewood waved him down. "Continue, Miss Whitfield." Clara turned toward the gallery. "Mrs. Cope, would you step forward?" Margaret Cope stood. She walked to the front of the courtroom with the steady gait of a woman who has carried heavy things her entire life and does not intend to put them down now. Mrs. Cope, Clara, said, "How many mail-order brides has Mr. Drummond brought to Cedar Hollow?" Margaret did not hesitate. "4 that I know of, including Miss Whitfield." "And what happened to the first 3? "The first 2 ran, left in the middle of the night. One went east, one went south." Margaret paused. Her voice dropped, but it carried to every corner of the room. The third was a young woman named Sarah Bowen. She arrived in the spring of 1879. She worked in Mr. Drummond's saloon for 4 months. Then she disappeared. No one saw her leave. No one heard from her again. The courtroom erupted. Voices overlapped. Chairs scraped. Someone in the back said loudly what half the room was thinking. Gatewood hammered his gavel 3 times. Order. He looked at Drummond. The pleasant mask had cracked. Underneath it, the color was draining from Drummond's face. Mr. Drummond, do you wish to respond to this testimony? Drummond stood. His voice was controlled, but his hands were not. They gripped the edge of the table, and his knuckles were white. Sarah Bowen left of her own accord. I have no idea where she went. This is hearsay and gossip. Gatewood's eyes moved to the back of the room. Doc Prentice was already standing. The old man had been waiting for this moment, the way a man waits for a wave he knows is coming. He had feared it and dreaded it and rehearsed it in his mind 100 times. And now that it was here, he found that the fear was still present, but smaller than the thing that stood behind it. Your Honor, Doc said, I have something to add. Approach. Doc walked forward. His medical bag was still in his hand, as if letting go of it would mean letting go of the identity that gave him the courage to speak. He set it on the floor beside the bench and straightened his back and looked the judge in the eye. In October of 1879, Sarah Bowen came to my office at 2 o'clock in the morning. She had been beaten. Her face was bruised. Her left wrist was sprained. She had marks on her neck, consistent with strangulation. She told me that Silas Drummond had attacked her when she tried to leave the saloon. She told me he said that no one leaves. She told me she believed he would kill her if she stayed. Doc's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. I gave her money from my own pocket. I arranged for her to leave on a freight wagon that departed before dawn. I told no one. I reported nothing, because I was afraid of Drummond, afraid of what he could do to me, to my practice, to this town. He paused. The courtroom was absolutely still. Not the quiet of an empty room, but the dense, charged quiet of a place where something has shifted and everyone knows it. I was a coward, Doc said. I am telling the truth now because there is a woman in this courtroom who deserves better than my silence. Clara stepped forward again. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the piece of cloth she had carried since the night she escaped through the saloon window. She held it up so the courtroom could see the name embroidered in blue thread. Your Honor, I found this in the room where Mr. Drummond locked me on the night I arrived. The bottom drawer of the dresser. A piece of cloth with the name Sarah Bowen stitched into it, left behind in the same room where I was imprisoned. This connects Sarah Bowen directly to Mr. Drummond's saloon and supports Dr. Prentice's testimony. She placed the cloth on the judge's bench beside the contract. Drummond's face had gone from red to gray. The claims adjuster beside him was staring at his papers as if they contained instructions for a situation that had moved far beyond anything contract law was designed to handle. Deputy Pike, sitting near the back, had removed his hand from the vicinity of his holstered pistol and was staring at the floor with the expression of a man who has just realized he has been standing on the wrong side of a line he did not know existed. Gatewood studied Drummond for a long time. Then he turned to Farwell. Mr. Farwell, your petition. Farwell rose. He was smoother than Drummond, calmer. He had the trained composure of a man who argued for a living and did not rattle easily, even when the man sitting 10 feet from him was disintegrating in real time. He presented his case with crisp, measured sentences. Clara Whitfield was an indigent woman living in an irregular domestic arrangement with a man who was not her husband. She had no legal standing, no financial means, and no demonstrated capacity to manage the estate left by her late father, Reverend Whitfield. Mrs. Adelaide Price, Clara's aunt, through her mother's line, was the natural choice for guardianship. She had the resources, the family connection, and the stability that the court should require. He placed his petition on the bench. Detailed, professional, the work of a man who understood that law was a weapon and knew how to aim it. Clara stood again. She placed the homestead document on the bench. A formal land claim for 160 acres filed with the county recorder, stamped and dated. Your Honor, the cabin where I live is on legally claimed land, filed and recorded with the territory of Wyoming 3 days ago. I have a roof, I have food, I have a home. She turned to Farwell. Mr. Farwell, you represent my aunt, Mrs. Adelaide Price, my mother's sister, a woman who has never once written to me. Not when my mother died. Not when my father locked me in a room for years. Not when I lost my teaching position and had no place to go. 27 years of silence. And now she sends a lawyer 1,000 miles because my father's land is suddenly worth something. Clara's voice did not waver. Her eyes did not leave Farwell's face. Mr. Farwell is not here for me. He is here for dirt. And I will not let my father control my life from the grave the way he controlled it when he was alive. Farwell's composure flickered. A muscle moved in his jaw. Clara was not finished. She reached into her stack of papers and pulled out the telegram. The one she had studied by lamplight. The one with W, office, in the faded mark of the Western Telegraph Station. There is one more thing, Your Honor. She placed the telegram on the bench. This telegram was sent to Mr. Caleb Merritt 8 years ago. It informed him that his intended bride had died of fever. There would be no wedding. She paused. The courtroom was listening with the intensity of people who can feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. That bride was me, Clara said. I did not die. My father locked me in a room and sent word that I was dead. He did this to prevent the marriage because another suitor, a wealthier man, had made an offer. The wealthier man died before any wedding could take place. And I spent the next 6 years imprisoned by my father's control. The murmur that moved through the room was not gossip. It was something raw. The sound of people recalculating everything they thought they knew. Clara continued. But this telegram was not sent from Pennsylvania. The signature reads W office. My father never abbreviated his name, and the sending station is marked Western. A telegraph office somewhere in the West. She turned and looked directly at Drummond. The man's gray face had not recovered its color. His hands gripped the table edge, and his eyes were fixed on the telegram as if it were a snake that had appeared on the judge's bench. Mr. Drummond lived in Pennsylvania before coming to Cedar Hollow, Clara said. He arrived approximately 9 years ago, 1 year before this telegram was sent. He told me to my face in front of Mr. Merritt that he knew my father, that he knew Reverend Whitfield better than I thought. She did not accuse, she did not speculate. She laid the facts beside each other, one by one, the way you lay fence posts in a straight line, and let the alignment speak for itself. I cannot prove who sent this telegram, she said, but I can place these facts before this court. Mr. Drummond knew my father. Mr. Drummond came west before the telegram was sent. The telegram came from the west. And 80 years later, Mr. Drummond placed an advertisement designed to bring me specifically to his saloon. He knew my name. He knew my history. He knew exactly which promises would make me sign a contract and board a train. The courtroom erupted. Drummond stood. For the first time, the mask shattered completely. His face twisted and his voice broke, and what came out was not the pleasant conversational tone he had practiced for years, but something raw and ugly. She is lying, he shouted. This is slander. She has no proof of any of this. But the desperation in his voice proved more than any document could. A man who was innocent would have been calm. A man who was innocent would have waited for his turn. Instead, Drummond looked like a man watching a house of cards collapse and trying to hold up every wall at once. Gatewood struck the gavel. Sit down, Mr. Drummond. You will have your opportunity to respond. Drummond sat, but the damage was done. Every person in that courtroom had seen the mask fall, had seen the cold thing behind it, had heard the fear in the voice of a man who had controlled this town for years through charm and money and the quiet threat of power. Clara stood at her table. Her hands were no longer trembling. Something had settled inside her during the course of the testimony, a calm that came not from confidence but from the simple act of telling the truth after years of being silenced. She had said what needed to be said. The rest was up to the judge. But the judge was not finished hearing testimony. Virgil Tate stood up in the gallery. He had been sitting near the back, his new hat in his lap, looking like a man trying to swallow a stone. He walked to the front of the courtroom and stood before the judge with his shoulders squared and his hands at his sides and his face the color of brick. Your Honor, I work for Caleb Merritt, have for 5 years now, seasonal. When Miss Whitfield first showed up at the cabin, I thought Caleb had lost his mind. More mouths to feed in a hard winter. I said as much to his face. He stopped, looked at Clara, then back at the judge. I was wrong. I have watched that woman fix fence in a blizzard with her bare hands bleeding. I have seen her ride 5 hours through a storm to bring a doctor back when Caleb was near dead with fever. I have eaten her cooking. When she had so little, I know she went without so the rest of us could eat. He swallowed hard. His eyes were bright with something he was not accustomed to feeling and even less accustomed to showing. If the court needs someone to say that Clara Whitfield is a woman of character and courage, and the kind of strength most men only pretend to have, I am saying it. And I will swear to it on anything you put in front of me. He sat down. His face was red. He put his hat on his head and stared straight ahead and did not look at anyone. The courtroom was quiet. Even Prudence Gatewood had lost the satisfied expression she had worn like a brooch all morning. She was looking at her husband on the bench with an uncertainty that Clara had never seen on her face before. Then something happened that no one expected. Rosie broke free from Hannah's arms. The girl slid off her mother's lap and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with the absolute determination of a child who does not understand that there are rules about who can speak and when. She walked straight to Clara and wrapped both arms around Clara's waist and pressed her face against Clara's hip. The courtroom held its breath. Rosie looked up at the judge. Her voice was small but clear, the voice of a 6-year-old who had listened to everything and understood it with the terrifying clarity that children sometimes possess. Miss Clara is the best person I know, Rosie said. Please do not let the bad men take her away. Hannah was on her feet, face white, already moving to collect her daughter. She reached Rosie and scooped her up, murmuring apologies to the court. But the words had landed. Every person in that room had heard them. A child had said in one sentence what no lawyer could have argued in an hour. Gatewood looked at Rosie for a long moment. Something moved behind the concrete of his judicial expression. Something that might have been recognition of a truth that existed beyond the reach of contracts and petitions and legal arguments. The truth of a child who loved someone and was not afraid to say so. He picked up the gavel. I have heard sufficient testimony to render judgment on both matters, he said. The courtroom went still, the kind of stillness that comes before a verdict when the air itself seems to hold its breath. On the matter of the marriage contract between Silas Drummond and Clara Whitfield, the court finds that the contract was entered into under materially false representations. Mr. Drummond represented himself as a ranch owner offering an honest domestic arrangement. Evidence demonstrates that he is a saloon proprietor who has engaged in a pattern of deception involving multiple women brought to this territory under false pretenses. The testimony of Dr. Prentice regarding the assault on Sarah Bowen and the physical evidence recovered from Mr. Drummond's establishment further undermines any claim of good faith. He paused. The room did not breathe. The contract is void. Miss Whitfield has no obligation to Mr. Drummond, contractual or otherwise. Clara's knees went weak. She gripped the table edge to keep herself upright. Furthermore, Gatewood continued the testimony regarding Sarah Bowen, combined with the evidence presented concerning the telegram of 1879, and Mr. Drummond's connection to the parties involved raises serious questions about Mr. Drummond's conduct that warrant immediate investigation by the territorial marshal. Mr. Drummond is to be detained pending that investigation. Deputy Pike is suspended from duty effective immediately pending review of his involvement. 2 ranchers from the back of the room, men who had been deputized that morning by the judge's order, moved toward Drummond. He stood. His face was empty, not angry, not defiant, empty the way a building looks after a fire has passed through it and left only the shell. For one moment, his eyes found Clara's across the courtroom. What she saw there was not hatred or rage, but something worse. The flat recognition of a man who has been outplayed by someone he considered beneath his notice. They let him out. The door closed behind him. The room exhaled. On the matter of the guardianship petition filed by Mr. Emmett Farwell on behalf of Mrs. Adelaide Price Gatewood said, the court finds insufficient grounds to grant guardianship of the Whitfield estate to a party with no demonstrated history of involvement in Miss Whitfield's life. Miss Whitfield has shown extraordinary capacity for self-reliance under conditions of severe hardship. She has secured stable housing on legally filed land. Multiple witnesses have testified to her competence and character. Mr. Farwell's client has provided no evidence of prior contact with or support of Miss Whitfield, and the timing of this petition coinciding with the discovery that the estate has appreciated in value suggests a financial rather than familial motivation. He set down his gavel. The petition is denied. Gatewood looked at Farwell with steady eyes. Mr. Farwell, Mrs. Price is Miss Whitfield's aunt. Family. If she wishes to be part of Miss Whitfield's life, that door is open. But guardianship for the purpose of controlling an estate is not something this court will grant. I suggest your client write a letter, a real one, not through a lawyer. Farwell stood. He gathered his papers with the precise movements of a man who packs a bag the same way, whether he has won or lost. He closed his briefcase, straightened his coat, walked toward the aisle. As he passed Clara, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, not angry, not triumphant, just clear. You can write to me, she said, if you mean it. If your client, my aunt, wants to know me rather than own what my father left behind, I will read the letter. Farwell stopped. For 1 second, something moved behind the professional mask, something that might have been shame or might have been the ghost of a family connection he had spent his career reducing to paper and profit. He did not speak. He walked out of the courtroom and into the cold Wyoming morning. Clara did not know if she would hear from him again. She found that she did not need to know. The courtroom emptied slowly. People filed past Clara with nods and murmurs. Some of the women who had whispered about her in the street now looked at her with something different in their eyes. Not all of them. Prudence Gatewood swept past without a glance, her back rigid, her jaw set. But others lingered, touched her arm, said small things that carried weight. One woman stopped. A younger woman Clara did not recognize, someone from the church auxiliary who had stood behind Prudence for weeks. She looked at Clara with eyes that were red and ashamed. I am sorry, the woman said. I listened to the wrong people. I should have listened to you. Clara took her hand. You are listening now. That is what matters. Margaret Cope reached her next, wrapped her arms around Clara without saying a word, and held on tight the fierce embrace of a woman who has watched someone fight a battle she herself was not brave enough to fight, and is grateful and humbled and proud all at once. Virgil stood at a distance, hat in hand, looking at the floor. Clara walked to him. Thank you, she said. He looked up. His eyes were bright. He shrugged one shoulder the way men do when they are feeling too much and have no practice expressing it. Just told the truth, he said. That is all. Doc Prentice was the last to leave. He stood by the courtroom door, his medical bag in hand, looking older than he had that morning, but somehow lighter, as if the weight he had been carrying for years had finally been set down, and the ground beneath him was more solid for it. Clara took his hand. You were brave, she said. Doc shook his head. You were brave. I was just late. He squeezed her hand once. Take care of that life you are building, Miss Whitfield. You earned every piece of it. The ride home was quiet. The winter sun was out, weak but present, and the snow along the road had begun to soften. Caleb drove the wagon. Clara sat beside him with her papers still in her lap, though they no longer felt like weapons. They felt like the closing pages of a chapter she was ready to finish. Halfway home, where the road passed through a stand of cottonwoods, and the snow had begun to melt into patches of brown earth, and new green, Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop. Clara looked at him. Why are we stopping? He set the brake, wrapped the reins around the post, climbed down from the seat, and walked around to her side of the wagon. He stood there looking up at her with the trees behind him and the sky wide and pale and the first real warmth of approaching spring touching the air. In the courthouse, he said, I told you that marriage was a legal solution, that it would protect you, that the court would see a stable home with two people instead of one. He paused. That was true, but it was not the reason. Clara did not move. She watched him from the wagon seat and felt something shift inside her chest, something slow and deep, like the earth moving beneath a mountain. I want to be with you, he said, not because of law, not because you need protection, not because I owe you or you owe me, because this life, this cabin, the sound of your voice in the morning, and the way you laugh when you think no one is listening, and the way you hold Rosie like she is your own, all of it, it is everything I told myself I would never have again. And I was wrong to tell myself that. He looked at his hands, scarred and rough, the hands of a man who had spent 8 years holding on to nothing but work and grief. I do not have a ring, he said. I do not have much of anything. But I have this land and these hands, and whatever time God gives me, and I want to spend it beside you. Not behind you, not in front of you. Beside you. Clara climbed down from the wagon. She stood in front of him in the melting snow, her dark dress, her pinned hair, her calloused hands and her steady eye. I do not need you to save me, she said. I know, he said. You saved yourself. I watched you do it. I need you to stay. I will not go anywhere. I would die before I left. She looked at him for a long time, at the scar on his hand and the lines around his eyes and the gray that was beginning at his temples. She saw the man who had waited 3 days in a hotel room for a bride who never came. The man who had locked himself away for 8 years with a portrait in a wooden box and a grief he could not name. The man who had let a stranger into his cabin because his sister asked and a child needed warmth. Then marry me because you want to, she said. Not because of a courtroom. Not because of a contract. Because you want to. I want to, he said. More than I have wanted anything since the day I forgot how to want. She stepped forward. He stepped forward. And in the middle of a muddy road between melting snow and bare cottonwoods, they kissed for the first time. It was not the kiss of young lovers or the desperate kiss of people who have run out of options. It was soft and sure and unhurried. The kiss of two people who had lost everything and found each other and understood that what they were building was not a fire but a hearth. The kind of warmth that does not blaze and fade but holds steady through the long nights and the hard years and the ordinary days that make up a life. They held the wedding under the cottonwood tree behind the cabin on a morning in late March when the first buds were breaking on the branches and the air smelled of wet earth and pine and the distant promise of summer. There was no preacher, no church, no congregation, just the people who mattered standing in a clearing with the mountains behind them and the sky above them and the dirt beneath their feet. Hannah stood to one side, crying without shame, her hands clasped in front of her. Margaret Cope stood beside her, jaw set against the emotion that kept trying to break through. Doc Prentice stood with his hat off and his thin hair blowing in the breeze and his medical bag, as always, in his hand. Virgil Tate stood to the other side, hat in hand, freshly shaved, looking as uncomfortable as a man can look, while also looking deeply and unmistakably moved. His wife Ada stood beside him, a quiet woman with kind eyes holding the hand of their 4-year-old son, who watched everything with the fascinated incomprehension of a child at a ceremony he does not understand, but senses is important. Rosie stood at the front. She had appointed herself to this position without consulting anyone, and no one had the heart or the authority to move her. Caleb took Clara's hands, rough on rough, callous on callous. The hands of two people who had spent their lives gripping things that tried to slip away and had finally found something worth holding. I give you all I have, he said. These hands, this land, my name, my word. I can carry you when you are tired, and I will never leave. His voice did not shake. His eyes did not leave hers. Clara spoke. Her voice was clear as creek water. I have known loss, she said. I have known the kind of silence that fills your bones and makes you wonder if you will ever hear anything again. But with you, I hear life. I hear the fire in the morning, and the creek at night, and your boots on the porch when you come home. I am not afraid of the road ahead. I will walk it with you. And if I have to, I will carry you too. Rosie stepped forward. In her hands, she held something small, a flower, purple, barely larger than a thumbnail, dried and pressed flat between two squares of paper. She had found it by the creek 2 weeks earlier, the first wildflower of spring, and she had pressed it in the pages of the Bible on the shelf above the stove. She laid it between their joined hands. Caleb looked at the flower, then at Rosie. Why the Bible, he asked. So we remember the first sign of spring, the girl said. Clara could not speak. Her heart was too full for words. Caleb knelt, and together with Clara, they placed the flower in a small hole they had dug at the base of the cottonwood tree. They covered it with dirt and pressed the earth flat with their palms, a flower buried where a family began. They stood. Caleb kissed her forehead. She kissed the scar on his hand, and the people gathered around them said nothing, because some moments are complete without words, and this was one of them. 5 years passed. The cabin grew. New walls went up, then new rooms, then a proper porch with posts that did not sag, and a railing Caleb built from cedar that smelled sweet in the rain. The barn doubled in size. The fence line extended across the north ridge and down to the creek. The herd grew to 40 head, then 60. A chicken coop appeared, then a smokehouse, then a garden where Clara planted cabbage and carrots and the wildflowers that Rosie brought home from the creek bed every spring. Rosie was 11 now. tall and serious and capable in the way of people who learned responsibility before they learned to play. She read every book she could find, borrowing from Margaret's store and from the traveling library that came through Cedar Hollow twice a year. She could braid rope and mend tack and calculate the weight of a steer by looking at it, and she was teaching herself to write in a journal she kept beneath her pillow. She came up the mountain every week with Hannah and stayed for days, and when she was at the ranch, she followed Clara the way a shadow follows light. Clara and Caleb had two children of their own. Bess was 3. Dark-haired and loud and fearless, she had been born in the cabin with Doc Prentice attending and Hannah holding the lantern, and she had entered the world screaming as if she already had opinions about the way it was run. The youngest was Thomas, 1 year old, named for no one in particular, Clara had said, but Caleb knew the name carried the weight of the life Clara had buried with her father, not a tribute to the man himself, but a reclaiming of the name, taking it back from cruelty and giving it to innocence. Baby Thomas had Caleb's gray eyes and Clara's stubborn chin, and he had recently learned to say one word with perfect clarity: Papa. He said it every time Caleb walked through the door, and every time Caleb stopped what he was doing and picked the boy up and held him against his chest with the same tenderness as he had shown that first evening when he watched Clara hold Rosie and felt something inside him shift. Virgil Tate still came each season. He brought Ada and their son, and the boy played in the yard with Bess while Virgil worked the fences and ate Clara's cooking and said little but meant everything. He no longer squinted at Clara with suspicion. He greeted her with a nod that contained the entire history of a man who had been wrong about someone and had spent years being right about them instead. Margaret Cope still tucked extra sugar into Clara's grocery bag, still squeezed her hand over the counter, still said for yourself with a wink that both of them understood was more than it appeared. Doc Prentice came quarterly to check on the family. He was slower now, his hands less steady, his steps more careful on the icy trails. But his eyes were sharp and his back was straight, and he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had found his courage late but had held on to it with both hands ever since. Prudence Gatewood had not spoken to Clara in 5 years. Clara did not mind. Some doors are better left closed, and the closing of them is its own kind of peace. Drummond's saloon had been sold to a man from Cheyenne who turned it into a mercantile. Drummond himself had been convicted after the territorial marshal's investigation uncovered not just the assault on Sarah Bowen, but a pattern of fraud and coercion stretching back years. The investigation into the telegram was never conclusive enough for a separate charge, but the evidence Clara presented had been entered into the record, and the judge had noted it in his ruling. Drummond would not be free for a long time. Sarah Bowen was never found, but her name was spoken now. She was remembered, and that mattered. Emmett Farwell had written once, a short letter, stiff and formal, addressed to Clara. Not from Farwell the lawyer, from Adelaide Price, Clara's aunt, dictated through him, but signed in a hand Clara did not recognize. The letter asked about Clara's health and her home, and said nothing about estates or money. Clara wrote back. She told her aunt about the ranch and the children and the mountains. She invited her to visit. No reply came, but Clara kept the door open because that was what Clara Whitfield Merritt did. She kept doors open, even the ones that might never be walked through. On a warm evening in late spring, Clara stood at the cabin door and watched her children play in the yard. Bess was chasing the dog around the woodpile, shrieking with laughter. Thomas sat on the porch in a patch of sunlight, chewing on a wooden block that Caleb had sanded smooth. Rosie sat under the cottonwood tree with her journal in her lap, writing something with the focused intensity that Clara recognized as her own. The cottonwood had grown taller and broader in 5 years. Its roots went deep into the earth, and its branches spread wide enough to shade the entire porch in summer. Somewhere beneath it, pressed into the soil, was a dried purple flower that a girl had placed between 2 scarred hands on a morning when the world decided to begin again. Caleb came up behind her. His arms circled her waist. His chin rested on her shoulder. He smelled of pine sap and leather and the sweet cedar of the porch railing he had just finished sanding. "You remember?" she asked. He did not need to ask what. 8 years, he said. I waited 8 years. Was it worth it? Caleb looked out at the yard, at the children, at the garden coming up green, at the fence line stretching clean and straight across the ridge, at the life they had built from nothing, from a telegram that was a late and a locked room that was a page in a saloon window, in a blizzard, in a courtroom, in a kitchen table covered in papers tied with string. from every broken thing that the world had thrown at them and every time they had stood up and kept going. He looked at Clara. His face had more lines now. His hair had streaks of gray at the temples. His hands were rougher than ever, scarred and calloused and strong. But his eyes were warm. The tiredness that had lived behind them for 8 years was gone, replaced by something that looked like peace. Every day, he said. The wind moved through the valley. It stirred the grass and rustled the cottonwood leaves and carried with it the smell of earth and wildflowers and the smoke from a chimney that stood straight and true. The sky was wide and the mountains were blue, and the road that Clara Whitfield had traveled so long ago stretched empty in the distance, carrying no one, leading nowhere she needed to go. She was already home. Above the clearing, the sky was clean. No clouds, no storms gathering on the horizon. And the only sound was the laughter of children and the creak of a porch built by a man who had learned after 8 years of silence that the best thing a pair of hands can do is build something worth staying for.